Okay, welcome everyone to the Cartographer office hours meeting. We're really glad to see you here. Let me share my screen here. All right, there you go. Does someone here would like to volunteer to take notes?
I got you. Could you just flick me the link? Thank
Yeah,
you.
sure.
Oh, it's up there. Notes and agenda.
Yeah.
I see it.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, and also feel free to add yourself to the attendance list. All right. New faces. I see here Montasir Shodori. I just hope I'm pronouncing well. Welcome. I'm glad to have you here. And if you like to say something, introduce yourself, will be awesome.
Hey, I'm from the, well, now part of the Cartographer team as of today. Yeah, I was previously on the SCC team and still getting to know Cartographer.
Yeah, me too. Awesome. Welcome, Montasir. Glad to have you here. All right. Reviewing outstanding RFCs. I want to go to the project here. From left to right, we have several RFCs sitting at the in review stage. First one being workload conventions. As far as I can see, it will have the enough approvals to be moved to, I don't know if to the final comment period or to be accepted. It has 7, I believe, approvals and 1 from a member from DOC. So I believe that will make it move to be accepted. Is that correct?
I think it's final
Is
comment
there
period
any-
to give people the opportunity or one
Okay.
last opportunity to yell before it's accepted.
Yeah, okay. So we'll move it to final comment period. If there's any objection, remember that the standard time for this stage is 7 days. To provide, comments, objections, observations before we discuss moving it to accepted. All right, we have others here in the in review stage. I don't know if we want to go each RFC.
Yeah, a couple of these are out of date and either need to be closed or rebased, and one of them at least has already been accepted.
Which one?
634.
Okay, resource tracing.
And 618 also.
Oh yeah. Okay. So let me update this. Resource tracing moves to accepted. And
maybe 618 also.
Oh yeah, I have the
Or maybe not.
Or I think it has the enough votes from TOC, but we need more approvals from the maintainers team. I think it will be 2 more.
Sorry, I thought this had approvals when I clicked on it. Never mind.
Yeah, no problem. So we hope you can give a review. Let me check the remaining RFCs. This one's still pretty much in review.
I don't know if this one's actually actionable as is. Like it's a pretty significant conflict to get it to a point where it's mergeable. I would probably recommend just closing it unless someone wants to take responsibility for shepherding it across the line, whatever's left.
Okay, any objection?
I think there was a desire to have these outcomes the outcomes of this, that we actually land on something where we can provide end-to-end artifact, or at least relate artifacts to where they came from. It may be a different shape. What do we do in the RFC process when we think we have to revisit something? Close it, open a new one, and reference it if we need to? Or is there some other process we should be using?
Yeah, I think it depends if the current design is reworkable or if it's just a start over kind of thing. So I was under the impression that we were inching towards something that would have been workable under this RFC, assuming we also have RFC 20, if we hold status updates.
And wasn't that the biggest issue? The holding status updates really changed the behavior of the whole pipeline. The whole
Totally right.
choreography.
I totally agree that like this is a decision we need to make. Yeah, so like, but I was under the impression that it was something that we did want to pursue.
I think if we saw a proposal that was more kind of updated to match what things look like right now, that was more tightly scoped that functionality of holding status updates to something that's optionally enableable per template, right? So like a template author can say, this obeys observed generation and follows all the rules that would, allow for that artifact tracing. If it were more of a tool, right, as opposed to a unilateral change across the whole runtime contract for all resources, then, I think that'd be a more interesting thing to look at. I know, Scott, you had kind of similar concerns about the runtime contract. Does that seem like it would help?
Yeah, my suggestion overall is to either rebase these and make them active or to close them. Having a bunch of RFCs that are just kind of stalled isn't particularly helpful.
But the point is that this one is actually one that we want to see an answer for, that we want to come up with a solution for what this is trying to tackle. I'm wondering if what Stephen just said could be put on this as a clear message of what's missing, so that it can be closed and either restarted or a fresh one can be started, but we have documented the criteria for getting a new RFC underway.
Does this RFC have an owner? Maybe that's the big problem here, is like,
Washuma, I think,
Yeah,
had
it's
it for a very
Washuma.
long time.
is Washuma still working on it?
I think it's like Scott said, it's stalled, right? We need to, I think we just need direction on whether or not like this is something we keep pursuing, right? And I think what you just said, Stephen, is like a good reframing. So
I think it's reasonable to keep pursuing a more limited, form of this as a tool, right? I think it's hard to say because there are a million ways we could do artifact tracing, right? We could rely on attestations created by all the individual components entirely outside of Cartographer to form that tree. But, if someone pulls it in your tool, then we lose the, linkage automatically. So I'm a fan of Cartographer adding individual tools that can be enabled per resource to help you achieve that. I think that's like a reasonable middle ground. But I also, I kind of, Scott, I was poking at you earlier because I know you had things about the runtime contract. Are you particularly, would you be opposed to a more kind of judiciously used kind of optional enableable version of that runtime contract change on a per resource basis, per template basis? Or at least, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, generally, I think we just need to see a more concrete proposal to have a sense about whether or not it works well.
Yeah.
So those of us who would love to see a proposal still don't feel like we have the criteria that would mean that we're going in the right direction, as this one didn't work because this one proposes that we change the runtime contract. Or
this proposes that we change the runtime contract across all resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then like as a default. And then I think, Scott, maybe you want to talk little more specifically about what else in the RFC is not ready and what it needs. I think a description of edge cases and a little more information about how that, you know, what would be held when, right? Because it is, you know, a complex change, right?
General rule of thumb is that, at least for me, any change that impacts the behavior of existing supply chains, like we need to be much more cautious about and really understand the side effects and the edge cases and how things could potentially go wrong.
So then, because yeah, I think like we did spend a bunch of time on this, right? And I think we kind of came to the conclusion that we could either have something totally out of band, not related to supply chains at all, that does a lot of this stuff, or we could, the only other way that we thought of was to hold status updates for certain resource types to ensure that we can observe the proper generation and match inputs to outputs. Does that whole like holding status, does that fall into that category, Scott, of things that are too dangerous to attempt?
I mean, it depends on the breadth and the context. So like, I'm not going to say universally that it's too dangerous, but like the bar is higher in my mind.
The RFC would need
Okay.
a lot more detail on those edge cases, and it probably shouldn't be something that we enable by default for everything, right? At least those two things.
So it would be an opt-in per template type thing.
I'm also not sure why, and this kind of gets into like, we get to see more detail, like why are we holding off on status updates instead of holding off on spec updates?
Sorry, did I say status? I meant spec, like holding off on spec updates.
Well, I think there's a way to do it both ways, kind of. It just one gets more complicated. But yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like, okay, we're actually talking about two RFCs, right? We're talking about RFC 18 as well as RFC 20. RFC 20 tries to tackle the status up or spec update behavior. So it really sounds like we need a simplified version of RFC 20 or a more specific version of RFC 20, which outlines the exact behavior of how resources might hold updates.
Yeah, and talks about what that interface looks like. You know, I could also see other ways if a resource presents its the output and the input in the status at the same time, right? Then you wouldn't need to change the runtime contract. You could just use that to make the association. And seeing that as a tool would mean that we can make less runtime contract changes to existing supply chains because those supply chains could, you know, for KPAC not need, for example, not need to implement that change if KPAC can present the source and along with the image and the output. That might be a better route.
Is that something we're going to ask KPAC to do? Because it doesn't do that right now, right?
It doesn't do that right now, but it'd be a very reasonable future request for them, I think.
Cool. And that would be, and like in your mind, the way that would work is that would be something you describe in the template that says like, hey, if these two things match, then things are good.
Yeah, I think that's a much safer tool, right, compared to the runtime contract change. But as long as they're all different tools for achieving that outcome, right, that a template author, as they're writing a template, should think, oh, if I want if I want artifact tracing, I should do this, or oh, maybe there's a configuration option that, you know, lets the resource provide that information separately somehow, right? It'd be good to see that in the RFC.
So, okay, that all makes sense. It's been a while since I've read it, but RFC 20 isn't all that far from that, I don't think. I think it talks about like a lot of those similar concepts. So can we maybe like try and reorient RFC 20 around this idea of like individual template, like modeling that behavior in individual templates as opposed to Cartographer as a whole. Because I really don't think it's that far away. But yeah, if there's like a couple like lines of feedback you could write in there, Stephen, to kind of get that point across, that'd be awesome.
Sounds good. Let's work towards that. And then we can come back and Scott, you can see if it covers the things we're looking for.
I think the behavior covered by 20 will also be easier to implement after the, I guess it's not an RFC yet, but it's a request for an RFC about understanding resource status.
Yeah,
Because then assuming statuses means health, then we'll have a notion about whether the stemmed resource is healthy or not.
yeah. That's a good point. So I kind of see it as like RFC 18 is possibly something to revisit entirely, but it's definitely blocked on RFC 20, and RFC 20 is potentially blocked on an outcome for the status request for RFC. So it seems to me that the path forward is to write the RFC for resource status and then figure out what sort of semantics we can fold back into RFC 20.
What's the resource status RFC?
The request for RFC. That's the one where this one.
694.
694. Right.
Put the link here.
Yeah, basically just allowing resources to report health state information so that we can then bubble that up into the workload status, and possibly other tools can make sense of that information.
So in summary, action items from these two RFCs will be to maybe suggest the author to close RFC 18 and then incorporate updates into RFC 20, and also a new RFC needs to be written for report status, resource status. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think in the interim, we could probably move RFC 18 and RFC 20 back into pending.
Okay.
Just take them out of in review.
Okay. Right. Any other comment regarding these two RFCs? No. All right. The only one, the another in review was introduced last week, so I believe it's still in review. It doesn't have enough approvals yet. So.
Yeah, well, I'm frustrated, but this one would simplify the user interface, but not the code. Would really like the option of having lifecycle be just baked into our code, which makes maintaining runnable harder, possibly. I'd rather it didn't emit a runnable under the hood. I think that's actually just surprising to people. I think finding out that they get a runnable and not the resource that's in the template is probably more surprising than if they just got the resources in the template that behaved with the new life cycle.
Can someone describe at a high level what this RFC is proposing?
You remember? Yeah, at a high level, this RFC is proposing that there is a life cycle field. It is actually a true false, but I agree with Scott that it would be it should be enumeration type, some sort of field that says that this is immutable resource. So next time you see an input, you have to generate a brand new output. And the way it was going to stamp out a new resource, and the way it was going to implement that was to create a runnable under the hood for the user. And that runnable would contain the and a run template at the same time. That is the actual template creator for that runnable. So to hide that implementation detail from the design or the CRDs you have to provide to the cluster.
I really like the separation, like that right now Cartographers, stays simple in its implementation of it, stamps out resources and moves things between them, right? And that we've, kind of pulled away the separate component that's responsible for garbage collecting, running of immutable, whatever. I also like that I think I am a fan of having runnable as a resource that shows up in the tree. If you look under the workload resource, right, there's one place where you get the status that is the latest, image build or whatever, right, translated from that garbage collected 10 runs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all that said, if there's a way to create like a convenience, template type, right, that kind of combines those things together, that gives you an easier interface for defining a template when you don't need the reusability of being able to reuse a run template across many cartographer templates, right, or like supply chain integrated templates, then that seems like it could be a very useful tool. I wonder if does that.
I mean, that's what's suggested
So-
here, but I feel like it's confusing. I feel like if you end up with a run template being generated and then runnables applied to it as you create this, it's just not a one-to-one mapping, I guess, between what you see in the template and what actually happens. It still adds that convenience method adds some smarts into Cartographer that tightly couples Cartographer to runnable. I think it needs more review, but that's where I was concerned.
That makes sense. I wonder if it's like having runnable not coupled to Cartographer, it's the rest of Cartographer, right? Is a design win, right? And if Cartographer has some special integration that's specific to runnable in the other direction, as a convenience feature for using this particular external service, I agree it'd be better if it didn't need to have that, right? But I don't like. It might be, not a terribly negative thing as long as runnable stays on its own, or is like still independently usable, right? Scott.
There were two primary concerns that I called out on this one. First, the idea of creating a cluster run template at runtime for the pipeline run that gets stamped out to be able to then reference feels like it's an extra impedance mismatch that we're just kind of hacking around again. So I suggested to basically inline the template directly into the runnable that gets stamped out, which should make the inputs and outputs a lot smoother. So there's a thread on that. The other concern was around just what other fields exist on runnable today that users might need to specify. So like at the moment, there's GC fields, and I think that's about it. That's like really important. But as we start to look at other concerns around the life cycle of how resources get updated, runnable is something where I could definitely see there being like additional lifecycle parameters that need to be set. Like, for example, don't update the spec until the current runnable finishes. Like I could expect to see that to be a common case, or to go ahead and update and then just give me the most recent finished on my status, or wait till the most recent stamped out version finishes and then update the status. So I think those are like different semantics that could become important on runnable in the future, that with this proposal wouldn't really have a clear place to exist without adding those fields into every single template.
And I feel like in all cases, this just adds complexity to Cartographer's own clean, or as clean as we have it today, design to generate an underlying object. It's a deep, to me, it's a deep integration with the runnable or the life cycle, the immutable life cycle behavior anyway. Yeah, and I stand that having yet another layer in the tree then doesn't become as easy as just knowing that that life cycle now behaves like runnable did. After you've made all of these changes.
I mean, fundamentally, the behavior needs to exist. So it's a matter of whether you force users to become aware in defining that behavior or whether they see it at runtime and how they see it at runtime.
Well, they have to define it either way, right? They have to define the behavior. That is to say, sorry, I see what you mean. You have to define the CRDs if you're using runnable. When I'm just meant that, yeah, they'd have to define that behavior in the template CRD. I do understand that there is an upside to having a cluster-wide run template. There may be one. I just like to know how solid that is, how important it is to have a cluster-wide run template, how that's an improvement over just ensuring that your template that you do use in your supply chain spells out the semantics of creating a immutable resource.
Joshua, please.
So the impetus for this change is to make, the developer's life easier and having to reason about less concepts. I wonder if just the inlining the template into the pipeline on its own, like, achieves part of that without like the rest of everything. So like one would be, so like, the first incremental change we could make is allow people to create their runnable object, inline their cluster run template into the runnable object, and then just use it like that. It's one less thing they'd have to reason about.
I think we tried that, creating a more inline version of this, skipping one of the levels in an earlier proof of concept. And the problem was having 2 layers of templating on top of each other. Like, I know, Ciro, when you presented the first version of runnable, you had the run template separate. And I said, why did you make run template separate? Why not just make it part of runnable and have it be definable in all one thing? And you convinced me that actually it just doesn't work. There's too many levels of templating on top of each other. And so you have to separate that part out. And so that's how we ended up with so many layers of indirection for this one, if that makes sense, is the double templating layer. But maybe that's solvable in a different way, right? Like we didn't dig that deep into it.
Doesn't that mean that if we were to inline it in the automated case, like if we were skipping runnable and inlining it, doesn't that even cause more problems then? Because then we're trying to machine mash together 2 templating layers.
Yeah. I think it's going to be hard to see this until we have some proposed YAML, right?
My question is,
please.
yeah, what's the value of bringing, like, how much value does this bring, having to work through this design at this point? Is there a strong drive to actually have this feature implemented anytime soon? Just a priority question.
Washuma's not here, but I know he's talked about it because he's trying to reason through all the tutorials, right? And every time that he goes through and explains what a supply chain is, he always has to stop at runnable and be like, oh, by the way, there's this whole other thing that you need to write and care about. So yeah, I think it's coming from a lot of the tutorial work that he's working on right now.
That's where my argument for entirely absorbing it into the template behavior comes from, is that in that situation, you also don't have to describe what gets created and why it's this other thing, and why it's this adapter, and why we have a special behavior anyway, where we can create one of those for you.
Yeah, but then we go back to Scott's point that he made earlier, right? Where you do have all these like runnable specific configurations that we'd have to roll up into every single template, like GC and like, like other lifecycle things. And that means like all of those specific features need to roll up into every single template, which I don't know, it's a thing that would have to happen.
Yeah, unless the supply chain supported those and they're considered safe broadly. I mean, we just haven't written for it. I think it's a good edge case, but if we design the YAML for that, what does that look like?
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
from
I'm
that,
not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's a thing
Yeah.
we'd have to design for.
yeah, it's just from that perspective of that, I'm like, yeah, users, I think, are the ones who don't really care about what runnable is. I'm curious about that being a valuable thing to people, other than runnable could be useful outside of this, and we could continue to support runnable as it's backed by the same library of code anyway.
I think if we feel like users don't care about the value that, in the common case, don't care about the value that Runnable provides, right? You know, having, I think it goes back to having some kind of convenience resource, right, that provides that functionality. I wonder if there's a way to have that convenience resource without kind of coupling ourselves. Like is there architecture we should propose for introducing, templates that work based on a duck type or something like that, right? Is there a way we can, could we create a separate resource that's not part of Cartographer or Runnable, or supply chain part of Cartographer or Runnable, that creates the necessary configuration for Cartographer automatically, right? Like I think there are probably ways of achieving that better user interface, right? That don't have the different drawbacks we've talked about, But I haven't read the RFC yet. Maybe this is all talked about.
Are you talking about like abandoning the generic runnable and designing like a purpose-built one for Tecton or something like that? So it's more domain specific and less confusing for people?
What if you introduced a new template type that has its own controller that degrades into, or that gets reconciled into a Cartographer template type that embeds a runnable, and it also creates a run template underneath, right? That like creates all these sub resources for you. Would that solve any problems? I guess it'd be hard to reference that or referencing that template type wouldn't reference the underlying components.
You still end up with at least one direction of coupling, right?
Yeah.
I'd have to know that you exist. Yeah. At the moment, what we do is we say that what you have to know exists is that there's a runnable type that will solve this problem for you. All right. And that's the loosest coupling we have, because Cartographer doesn't care. That's what we have today. Any of these other proposed solutions seem to couple us to the concept of immutable, however we decide to implement it. All right. I don't know that there's an obvious inversion. But you're saying, can we maintain that lack of that complete decoupling in some way that makes it simpler for people to rationalize?
Yeah, I don't have an immediate solution to it. It also, again, like if we need a couple, if we can keep Runnable separate, but Cartographer needs some extra stuff, right, in order to make it easy to use Runnable, that doesn't seem like a terrible outcome, right? I agree it's less desirable than completely separate, but as if Runnable is still this kind of independently usable tool, right? It doesn't seem terrible. It feels a little better because it's still kind of a tool around orchestration that's usable generically. It feels better than if we added a KPAC specific feature into Cartographer, right? But that said, I definitely agree, it'd be better if they were totally decoupled.
Honestly, like runnable basically goes away for 99 all of our use cases right now if Tecton triggers had a static template trigger thing, right?
So you're saying let's leave Runnable where it is and promote or even create better controllers for, or translation controllers even. I mean, what Stephen was saying, but maybe specific, might be the easy way to solve for that. Says you create a tecton immutable run, right? That you can update, sorry, mutable run that you can update as you wish. And we do the translation in between and update it. I mean, that's what Runnable does generically today, right?
I think a nice thing about Runnable is it lets an end user say, oh, I want to use Argo workflows instead, or I want to use, any other tool that behaves like Tecton. I want to use jobs because I don't have Tecton installed, right? That seems super valuable. And so I still see a lot of value in what Runnable provides. But if there were a Tecton specific interface for doing this, and users didn't have to use Runnable as often, that seems supplemental, right? That seems like it could be a good outcome also.
I guess I just want to take it back to that point. Is the use case of describing how you set things up to users and then walking them through what they actually get improved or enhanced by this feature? Because if it's not, I would rather not implement something like this, which feels like it's starting to couple something that was well and truly decoupled. And it only takes it ever so far. It still leaves a lot of baggage behind. And I think from a user's perspective, regardless of how you feel about clean separation of concerns, just having a template that behaved one way or the other because of a generic late life cycle field would just be healthier. It'd be easier to understand as a user.
I think if somebody wants to propose an interface that makes it easier for users to use Runnable and Run Template, I'm happy to look at that and give my feedback on it. But I'm personally not, it's not at the top of my, like, I don't know if customer XYZ saying I need this, feature. Oh, sorry. I don't know if user XYZ of Cartographer saying I need this feature tomorrow, right?
I mean, I ask simply because there's so much energy that I would happily pour into this, but I don't think it's that important at the moment.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Great. Thank you. So yeah, please feel free to add all your concerns, objections, observations to the thread for each one of the RFCs. So everyone out there will be able to comment also. All right, so next up will be the RFCs that are sitting here in the technical oversight committee for a while. It will be basically a multi-path discussion. Any update, any comment around two RFCs?
So there is another request for RFC that kind of supersedes the snippets one. This is the one, it's called Single Blueprint Architecture.
Yeah. Do you have the link handy, or do you want to share your screen?
I can send a link. That one.
All right. Okay. I'm on the
So this is something we've been talking a bit about out of band. I'm not sure we've ever talked about it in a meeting, but it's the idea that we've been thinking about what it might look like to merge supply chains, deliveries, templates, all into a concept called blueprints. And then those would all be typed based on the current template types. And then by doing something like that, we would also inherently have to tackle composability because we're basically getting rid of templates. And so this is a request for an RFC that tackles just this aspect, which kind of like would clean up a lot of our CRD usage.
Comment around this request for RFC?
Does this one include extending the blueprints with snippet-like functionality, or is this just the renaming and the merging of the resources together?
Well, this does tackle folding templates into that same concept, right? And so if we're folding templates into a common blueprint, then it kind of necessitates the ability to embed blueprints in other blueprints, right?
Might be good to mention that in the issue description. I just wasn't sure because I could see like, yeah, they're all merged together, but you can only reference, you know, ones that look a particular way in certain circumstances, right? You can only reference the templatey ones.
The templatey ones, but that's like, yeah, part of the goal is to like get out of the idea of like the templatey ones, right?
Right. Totally agree. All right. It'd just be good to put that in the thing.
Yeah. So yeah, our requests for RFCs are kind of a new thing, and I don't know how much detail to put into them, but yeah, I'll add that. I'll add that to it.
I think this drives us to having kind of more distinctly defined architectural components for Cartographer. Like if we've talked about, you know, moving away from the mono repo longer term, right? Now we have convention service living as a separate repo also. You know, I think this makes it more clear that you have like the blueprint component that supports the stamping out, right? Is one thing, and then runnable is another thing, and then convention service is another thing, right? And they're all tools that kind of, you know, work together to deliver the functionality that the project delivers. I think the supply chain and delivery being, you know, different tools with the same implementation, right, is a little, you know, makes it hard to tell that story right now.
Yeah. Scott, do you have any insights into like what this might entail? Good or bad?
The biggest thing that jumps out at me is flattening both the workload and deliverable resources, because those do have different purposes and intents. And since they're both selected, I guess previously by the cluster supply chain or cluster delivery, like you would want to make sure that your supply chain blueprints versus your delivery blueprints are selecting the right thing.
I think we were still intending to have the multiple shaped owners, as we call them. So that there would still be a workload, which we might call a supply chain, and a delivery, which we deliverable, which we might call a delivery. That's something that Stephen was suggesting, and I don't hate it. But the idea, though, is that you still have those owner types. You select for them, so your blueprint can still, if it's selecting for something, can still select for a kind. That can now select for a kind.
The selector would need to distinguish based off of kind.
Yeah, and that way we get a way to do migrations when we implement this. We can continue to have fully circular migrations back down to workloads with supply chains and deliveries and deliverables, right?
Yeah.
I don't think you can use a conversion webhook between different resource names. So
Right, that's a good point.
yeah, like some
Yeah.
of that is a little harder to implement than you know.
Yeah,
Well, I needed
the-
someone to tell me that because that's what we were thinking at the time. Yeah.
the two ways to do it are to either write a controller that basically just takes resources of one kind and copies them over to the second kind and then reflects back the status. So that'll allow you to do one-way migrations. The other way of doing it is to take the previous API and stand it up as an aggregated API, and then sort of back those logical resources with other physical resources. So that way you can sort of do the translation bidirectionally at runtime. But if you wanted the old resources and the new resources to be in the same API group, then that gets weird.
Uh-huh. I mean, again, it's not the main reason. The main reason would be because there are different shapes. Yeah, different configuration shapes where we don't think the params make the right sense. This should be something you can trust shape-wise that exists in your workload or in your deliverable. Certainly, no one needs the 3 options for the source kinds. All right, source git, source URL, and source image just don't make sense in and image don't make sense in the deliverable. They just need the source.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is gonna be challenging.
So next step will be to, these 2 RFCs will remain at this stage, just waiting for a new RFC that could eventually supersede them, or should we move them to pending?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, any objection? Any other comment, update? Let me check here. No additional discussion topic as far as I can see. Okay, so if that's the case, thank you so much for your time. See you next week. Bye.